again. And as Her Majesty the Queen died 48 hours ago, almost exactly, I thought it's apposite to pay tribute to our late Sovereign Lady. So Her Most Gracious Majesty was called to her reward at the age of 96. It was Thursday, the 8th day of September, the year of grace, some 2022, when she breathed her last at her private residence in Balmoral Castle, Aberdeenshire, Scotland, United Kingdom. She was there for a customary summer holiday, which used to go well into September, and she'd been very indisposed for the past couple of years. Her mobility had been decreasing. There'd been a general physical declension, and that people knew that she was ever more infirm, and that had been confirmed. She'd been using a wheelchair in private. But I don't want to concentrate too much on her dotage and her declining years, but on her contribution, on her accomplishments in her 96 years. So remember, she was the daughter of a younger son, and initially it was thought improbable that she'd ever inherit the throne. She's born on the 21st of April, 1926, in a house on Bruton Street, London, that no longer stands. It was destroyed by a Luftwaffe bomb in the Second World War, and the Sir William Joynton Hicks, who was the Home Secretary at the time, he had to attend the birth. As Home Secretaries had to attend royal births at that time to scotch any rumor of this being a foundling or a changeling, a baby smuggled in the warming pan, as was said of the birth of the old Pretender in 1688. So her father was Prince Albert, the Duke of York, being the youngest son of King George V. And he wasn't meant to inherit the crown. Of course, George V died, and then George V's eldest son became King Edward VIII. But King Edward VIII abdicated after 11 months. That's another story. And so the next son down, that's Prince Albert. That was the Queen Elizabeth's father. He became king. But that Prince Albert, he chose to reign under his middle name, George. So he's King George VI. So on her mother's side, the Queen was from a Scots noble house. Her mother was the daughter of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Anyway, so 4 years later, the Queen was joined by her younger sister, Princess Margaret, and the newsreels openly said the nation was disappointed by the birth of a girl. We had prayed for a prince. Quite staggering that they should be so flagrantly sexist. Marion Crawford, a Scots schoolmarm, was her governess, and she was always fairly serious-minded, though energetic, go-ahead, sensible, had a wise head on her shoulders. And that governess published a tell-all, The Little Princesses, which is entirely laudatory, but nevertheless, the royal family thought it was a deep betrayal and would never speak to her again, anything like that. So she was then when her father became king, she was a presumptive, not heir apparent, because of course, had her mother given birth to a son, then that Princess Elizabeth, as she then was, would have been pushed down the line of succession, and her baby brother would have been out the higher the line of succession. So she was educated solely by tutors. She didn't go to school at all, and she was at Windsor Castle in the Second World War, and she went to Eton for lessons with Sir Henry Marten, the Vice Provost of Eton at the time, who was knighted just at the end of the Second World War. Sorry for breaking up like that. So she learned some French, German. Not a fantastic scholar, I think, not dreadful either. She acted in amateur dramatics in Windsor Castle, played the breeches roles. She's involved in the Royal Windsor Horse Show towards the end of the Second World War. A fundraising effort started in May 1944, is going to this day. So she had a girl guides company with girls from the upper class, so she get along with. Only a few hundred of them left. What else about her? Who was she to marry? It was decided at the age of 13 that she ought to write to a boy, because a lot of teenage girls were writing to young men in the armed forces. Well, there was her second cousin once removed, Prince Philip of Denmark and Greece, who was 6 years older than her. Sorry, 5 years older than her. And then she wrote to him, and the romance blossomed. So in 1947, they went on a cruise to South Africa, visited South Africa and what was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, visited the grave of Rhodes. They wouldn't do that again. And she used to think about, was she serious about this chap? Would she get engaged to him? She turned 21 in Kaapstad, and that's where she delivered her famous broadcast to the Commonwealth. I declare that my whole life, be it long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the great Commonwealth family to which we all belong. In such cut glass tones that would seem comical today. So they were married in September 1947. And just over a year later, they're blessed with their firstborn, Charles Philip Arthur George, who's currently the king. Yeah, what else can I say? So she was always faithful to the marital bed, no doubts about that. She was always presentable. She never let the side down. She just occasionally said something she shouldn't have. She eschewed smoking. She scarcely drank. She was ate healthily, not too much, given that they have the most delectable Lucullan banquets offered to them. Even Tony Blair was always slender and said, I noticed the royal family ate very little. So she's head of the Church of England. They say she tends towards the Low Church. And she was increasingly having to take over her father's duties that were delegated to her as her father was growing ill. Eventually, he had lung cancer. Of course, so he died in February 1952, the 6th of February, when she and her husband were on a Commonwealth tour there in Kenya when her father died at Treetops, and Prince Philip had to break the news to his wife that her father had expired in the night at Sandringham. So the Queen flew back to the United Kingdom. Apparently, mourning dress had to be brought onto the plane so she could come off the plane in mourning, and that was it. She was Queen instantaneously. Churchill was back as Prime Minister. So the coronation took place the following June 1953. Unfortunately for her, the skies did not smile upon her and the heavens opened. And even though it was meant to be the driest day in June, there was the most torrential downpour. But nevertheless, the show must go on. And it was a fantastic coronation, really lifting Britain's spirits after years of austerity caused by the Second World War. And I don't want to get into all the political machinations down the decades. But she was a figure for continuity. She was sagacious, and she eschewed any political involvement, neither expressing approval nor disapproval of any prime minister or any view. So a very little idea what she believed. So the crown is above politics, and she essayed to be someone who observed the strictest neutrality on all controversial matters. She always followed prime ministerial advice, always signed anything that was given to her in the Privy Council saying approved, and so forth. So right after she was crowned, she went on a Commonwealth tour. I remember the British Empire, some people thought had quite a long way to go back then. Went as far as Australia and New Zealand. Though other British monarchs had been to Australia and New Zealand, they hadn't been reigning monarchs before they'd inherited the crown. So I remember one New Zealander in 2002 commenting on it saying, it was people treated it as though it was the second coming of Jesus Christ. It might seem like a profanity to say that, but that was the comparison he made. So she was adulated. And a third of the British public in opinion polls thought that she'd been summoned by God for the august destiny that had been conferred upon her. Anyway, so she was someone who had the greatest decorum, and the words gracious majesty really became her. It was an awful lot to live up to. A somewhat bland character. I sometimes think we've been perhaps too hagiographic, and she's not superhuman, and she deserves criticism too. Was she a little cold? Jenny Bond, the BBC royal correspondent, said, I was the royal correspondent for decades. She knew who I was. She never acknowledged me, things like that. Her Majesty the Queen did not grant interviews, which is probably a wise thing to do. So she could get along with other people. People said she had a wicked sense of humour. She knew how to laugh politely to defuse situations. Some people broke royal protocol. You weren't to touch her. Paul Keating, the Prime Minister of Australia, famously got it wrong in the 90s, patting her back. She reacted well to that. Michelle Obama likewise touched her arm, but the Queen just sort of turned it into a gentle hug and things like that. The Queen was someone of physical courage. In 1986, she was riding a famous horse, Burmese, down the Mall as part of a parade, because right up to the age of 60, she rode in military parades, rode side saddle, when someone fired shots at her. Well, he was lucky the police got him before the crowd did, because they would have ripped him apart. And the man had a few months in prison. There was also that guy, Michael Fagan, who broke into Buckingham Palace and sat on her bed. And she woke up and said, what are you doing here? Was able to press a panic button. The different stories, did she press it straight away? Did she have to chat to him tranquilly before he could be overpowered by the officers, before she was able to summon them? I don't know. So, yeah, and she got along with all sorts of political leaders, including absolutely loathsome ones, someone as vile as Kelvin Mackenzie. And she bore herself with the greatest possible dignity through all sorts of travails, all sorts of disgraces, other members of the royal family letting the side down, by marital infidelity, by really putting their foot in it and things like that. But she had difficult times, the notorious Annus Horribilis, as she dubbed it, I think, in 1992, with various, with divorces, with the Windsor Castle fire, and things like that. So when other Commonwealth realms chose to dissolve the monarchy and adopt the Republican Constitution, she accepted that with good grace. She was a monarch. She was not a politician. She would not campaign in referenda to maintain the monarchy. That was people up to her. She wasn't going to beg to be a monarch. So I think she showed people how to do it. And as I say, she's not perfect. She was on the diffident side, as Tony Blair said, and perhaps you would be if you're surrounded by people constantly gawping at you, hanging on your every word. She was an effective public speaker, a dull one, because I suppose she didn't have to shout to be heard. People were going to listen to her anyway because she's the queen, not because that they desperately wanted to, or she had anything contentious to say. She was told to steer clear of controversial matters. So that was her. So the Queen, yeah, I think she was a great role model to people. She tried to run her household with economy. She was also a fashion icon, wearing a bright color, a bold hat, so she could stand out in the crowd and things like that. You sometimes saw when she's faintly annoyed when people walked into Sandringham and they saw the horses, and she said, and they said, "Oh, they're nice horses here," or things like that. She liked to play jokes on people. Some American tourists who met her in the Highlands of Scotland who didn't realise who she was, and she played along with that, saying that she'd never met the Queen, which I suppose is absolutely true, unless they're talking about her late mother. So that was her, someone who comported herself with the greatest honour throughout her long life. But as I say, she too was imperfect. She occasionally slipped up, saying the miners' strike was due to one man, Arthur Scargill, saying Manchester was not such a nice place. The Mancunians were mortally offended. She had to make it up to them. So even she was capable of making a mistake just occasionally. Yeah, so she'd been slagged off by Lord Altrincham in 1957, saying she's like a cross between a priggish schoolgirl hockey captain and a candidate for communion and things like that. He got punched in the face by some ultra-nationalists. But anyway, some people like Lord Charteris said, no, actually, Lord Altrincham was being helpful and he was on the money, and we had to reform and modernise the monarchy. So that's her. She saw through 15 prime ministers, not very well served by all of them. Her gracious majesty, her Britannic majesty, she was, and she had all sorts of honours heaped upon her. But she didn't let it go to her head, because you could be absolutely ludicrous and mental, a bit like Prince Andrew, thinking that you really are superhuman when you get all this unearned adulation. So if you look back in a family tree, you see, His Majesty, Her Majesty, His Royal Highness, Her Royal Highness, Lord, Lady, Earl, Duke, Count, for generations. It goes several generations before you find someone who's a plain Mr. or Mrs. And she's obviously partly Germanic, Danish, French, all sorts of Swedish, Norwegian, Spanish, if you go very far back. She's definitely a little bit black if you go to the Middle Ages. So yeah, it was already a multiracial royal family. The head of state of right by the end of her life, by 15 realms, including the United Kingdom, and most of which are non-white realms. People don't seem to realize, some Caribbean countries and so on, or the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu. Well, thank you so much for watching my channel. Please send me your comments, request any more videos, and make sure you donate on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. I'm most ingratiated to the person who gave me a donation of considerable liberality a couple of days ago. And I do tours in London. You can do royal tours in Londinium. So I look forward to hearing from you. And if you want any video requests, direct message me on this channel. Goodbye, everyone.